this is more than I ever would have expected to see from this guy or from a Canadian prime minister in general. So, like a rich country head of state.
Well, it has to come. It has to come from a rich country for it to have any weight, right? Because uh, people in Gaza can complain about the liberal order or whatever, but nobody cares, right? Unfortunately, but that's the
Yeah,
truth.
presidents in
It
Latin
has.
America have said versions of this before and nobody cared. What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, and I'm here today for a special episode to unpack the profundity and the banality, possibly in certain parts, of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos. I said in my newsletter it was like the most important IR speech in 50 years. I might caveat that a little bit at this point, but I was a little overreacting possibly in the moment. But it is a pretty profound speech about global rupture. And with me to sort of unpack it all is Seva Gunitsky at the University of Toronto. What's up, man? How you doing?
Hey, how's it going?
So what do you want to tell the people about your background besides being at University of Toronto?
I grew up in the USSR, and then I left right before all the shit went down. And then I moved to America.
You mean the end of the Cold War?
That's right. And then I went to the US, and I left the US right before all the shit went down. And now I'm in Canada. So if I'm ever planning to leave Canada, you got to be paying attention, Van, because I seem to be getting out of these things just before everything falls apart. That's been my pattern.
Yeah, that makes me want to not be wherever you are.
I've heard that.
Yikes. Okay, I saw this speech almost in real time, and my first thought was that whoever wrote it had definitely had some exposure to Antonio Gramsci, or at least to critical theory. And then my second thought was that Eikenberry must be shitting himself because this is the end of his project, with a fucking fork in it, it's what was your reaction when you first saw it, or what were your first you wrote about this in your newsletter also?
Yeah, well, I could tell it was going well because even the Twitter socialists were like, yeah, this guy's a lib, but he's making a lot of sense. They give it a pass. I'm like, oh, this is really reaching people. But then, of course, why wouldn't they embrace that? He's a sensible Canadian technocrat, central planner. It's what the Soviets always wanted. I'm sure Americans must be a little bit jealous, but I'm happy about it.
What's your sense of Canadians' views of Mark Carney? Because I had viewed him pretty negatively as the typical liberal kind of centrist. Like all of Europe is governed by liberal technocrat types who are profoundly mismatched with the moment that we find ourselves in history, and don't seem to be willing to entertain diagnoses of problems, and don't seem to be willing to entertain solutions to problems either. They just want to fucking cruise. And I thought Mark Carney was of that same stock, but is that right, wrong?
Well, I was worried about that too. He's kind of an intellectual. That's very dangerous. You don't want intellectuals in your office. I'm coming from Russian history. Gorbachev was all about that. We know how that turned out. But I think what's different about Carney is he's coming from the finance world. So he kind of knows how the real world operates, that it's not enough to just keep issuing these platitudes and hope everything works out. And plus, I think he probably understands Trump's world better than a lot of people, because Trump, he's not really into the national interest. He's into enriching a certain oligarchic class. And I think Carney understands that better than most people in Europe, given his experience. And so I think, again, he's cynical enough to say what's really going on. And in that sense, it took this Canadian technocrat to really capture the moment. And I'm glad.
Maybe we should play a couple short clips from it, and then we can kind of react and then move on from there and just kind of zoom out. All right, so this is the opener of the speech.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. So what are our options?
If you're an IR head, you've read The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. But what is the sort of misrepresentation or like fake lesson learned that everybody takes from Thucydides that he's sort of gesturing at here?
Yeah. So this is one of those lines that gets used a lot and people don't really understand it. People love to sort of pluck it out with no context. And especially people like Stephen Miller and others who think that power rules the world, the people who think of themselves as these tough-minded people, these pragmatists, these realists, that, you know, this is the world of governed by force, all of that stuff. And this is the eternal law of the world since the beginning of time. But, you know, I would bet none of those people have actually read what happens after that, which is that Athens essentially destroys itself through hubris, right? And it's not accidental, right? It's the same hubris that leads them to say the weak suffer what they must. That's the same hubris that leads them to overreach and invade Sicily, and then their empire is destroyed. So I think people employ that quote to say, oh, this is a timeless law of global politics, but it's not. It's Athens at the peak of its, right? The great power that's so convinced it's invincible or it's powerful, it can no longer see what's going on. It can't perceive its limits. To me, that sounds a lot like some other great powers right now.
Not naming names, just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think I have to name names. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it drives me crazy actually for, I mean, God, decades now to know the historical arc of Athens' fall and to know that it starts with the damn Melian dialogue and this famous quote, and then to have like a major paradigm in IR basically use that quote as their bumper sticker, and then for that to not be an indictment of the paradigm, you know, like what?
Talking about realists by any chance?
Yeah,
I
like,
mean, look, I don't want to like paint with a broad brush. I think there are a lot of realists who recognize the quote for what it is, which is, it's not advice. It's a note of caution, right? Do not conduct a strategic overreach, right? That's the thing I think a lot of people misunderstand is rejecting imperial overreach, rejecting imperial hubris. It's not about morality. It's not about the weak overcoming the strong or anything like that. It's about, you know, if you don't understand what you're doing, you're going to overreach and you won't realize what you're doing until it's too late, right? So
yeah,
there's nothing really even liberal about this quote, right? Or interpreting the quote. It's, do you know yourself well enough to conduct yourself as a great power? And, you know, as like I said in the piece, I think Carney thinks, and I think he's right, that the US is now in its million moment with Trump and Miller and all those people. So maximum confidence, minimum self-knowledge. That's what destroys great powers. That's the lesson from that quote. Not that power rules everything, but if you overreach, you're going to pay for it.
yeah, totally. I mean, I wish kind of realism, I wish the sort of maximalist, sort of caricatured versions of realism, like the tragic, the offensive realism, were some sort of separately named tradition. Because the kind of realism that you're talking about with like Hans Morgenthau, right, E.H. Carr kind of, these are like thinkers who were always trying to keep the powder dry, not overreach, not lean into arms racing, not, you know, like they were trying to be almost like careful. You don't want to live in permanent tragedy. And
Remember,
that's just such a different sensibility than the quote,
absolutely. I mean, you remember the first Bush, the keyword prudence, right? He was like that kind of old school realist. I mean, I studied Ken Waltz, and he never liked like the new realists. He did not buy the Mearsheimer thing about offensive realism. He didn't believe in that distinction because the main thing, if you're like a classical realist, is exactly that: caution, prudence. There's like a Burkean conservative element to it, right? Don't start breaking shit up until you know what's going on. And the people who style themselves realists today, I think, completely ignore that. I think we're seeing that right now.
Yeah. There's also a realism that's outside of the IR tradition that I don't even know if you're familiar with it, but it comes through Gramsci as at first and then Stuart Hall later. But it's realism in the sense that like if you're operating with a theory of change, like you're trying to change the world in some way, it's imperative that you understand the sort of field of forces that constitute reality. And the most efficient way to sort of navigate reality. So like you cannot live in a fantasy. Like you have to live in the real, because how else are you going to manipulate the field of forces? But the most efficient way to do that is to find the contradictions among those who rule, among the powerful, and then work from the contradictions to like instantiate change or like demand change or organize for change or whatever. And so this is like a way of thinking that is totally realist, but it adds something to sort of the tragic sensibility. It's obviously not Burkean because it's not preservationist. It's trying to like almost go in a different way, but it's also like profoundly, I mean, scornful of the kind of Mearsheimer type shit. And this is we're talking in the language of realism and IR right now, but like this is a space where like certain types of conservatives and certain types of like, I don't know, socialist, anti-imperialist, whatever, find a kind of common cause, which is also a kind of moment that we appear to be in. Like,
Well,
yeah.
you called him a Gramscian, which I enjoyed. Like, and you said you implied that you think it's the best speech in 50 years, but then you kind of backtracked. So I'm curious first, what made you give that first assessment? And then on second thought, what made you back up from it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so he was the Carney is identifying the core contradiction of the. So we didn't play this part of the speech, but he talks about the rules-based international order, and he's like, this was half a lie, or it was a hypocrisy of sorts. And that acknowledgement, I have never seen it come from a head of state in a rich country in the global north or the west or whatever. Never, not once, not once. And they've had many opportunities because all they do is fucking go to meetings and give speeches. And so like, how many of these Davos things have there been? No one's ever said that. And critical scholars have been saying that ever since we've been using the phrase rules-based international order, right? Like this is a living lie. And so, and like actually I should play the end of his speech soon, but he talks about how like part of what needs to be done here is not live that lie anymore. If you're going to live in reality, face the reality and call it for what it is, and then go accordingly. So all of that is quite profound. And to announce that we're in a post-hegemonic epoch or whatever, that seems, again, profound. And so all of that signals to me, for an IR head, the most important reorienting shit that you could ever see come from a head of state. Certainly in my lifetime, I can't think of a bigger IR speech. Like Obama's Global Zero speech was big, but it didn't reflect reality. It was just words, like it didn't match what was happening or what he did. This is describing a huge change. And he's even calling it. He's like, this is not a transition. This is a rupture.
Very Gramscian, yes.
Yes, which is Gramscian language. So all of that is profound. I think the thing that makes me back off of it a little bit is that some of these middle parts of the speech and then the end where he starts getting to like what is to be done, given, okay, I've got a new analysis. Now what do we do? the stuff he starts saying is very like, is that all you got? Like,
Boilerplate, right?
what's
He
that?
goes back to being a regular lib, right? Not
Yep,
not enough.
yep. Yeah.
It was wild to see a banker employ Václav Havel's greengrocer metaphor, which is the classic anti-communist sort of metaphor against the capitalist hegemon. For me, anyway, I think it worked. I don't know how other people felt about it, but I
Well,
liked it.
it was only like 30 seconds or something. Let me play it real quick.
In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with the greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. 4 decades.
All right. So from there, he goes into the rules-based international order hypocrisy, and like he describes Canada as performing American hegemony in effect, and then calling it rules-based international order. Yeah. So that's like pretty big shit.
It's a little self-serving, can I just say, to call himself the greengrocer. He's really like, Canada's more like one of the apparatchiks who's handing out the signs to the greengrocer, right? He's being a little bit convenient about Canada's role here. Like it wasn't just this passive recipient of the global order. It was also a major beneficiary. But in another sense, he's right that, Canada is willing to put up with the partial hypocrisy of the liberal order as long as it gets those public goods that Carney is talking about. And when those public goods disappear, you got to take the sign down. In that sense, he's right. Like it's that order depends on a mutual agreement, right? It's not just the U.S. enforcing it, right?
This whole like performing compliance as part of hegemony there's a literature that supports this, but it's fascinating. It's like an underemphasized element of hegemonic political ordering is that you have this, I mean, like it's sort of evidence of consensualism as opposed to domination. Like the claim that you're not purely dominating is based on evidence of compliance, like non-coerced compliance. And so when you remove the performance of compliance, when you stop putting the sign in the window, when you stop using the vocabulary that Washington insists that you use and all of that, the edifice collapses. I mean, or the hegemon, who is no longer a hegemon at that point, is forced to rely on techniques of domination purely.
And that's how it's always been. I mean, for all the shit that Eikenberry gets, I think he's right on this point, that the U.S. was unique in that it kind of self-restrained itself a bit, right? Obviously, the U.S. still doesn't
not enough, but yeah, there was some restraint,
but enough that countries that were affected by it were able to tolerate it, right? And look, I've criticized the liberal order myself many times. It seems to me like you're more happy about the liberal order ending than I am, but maybe we can talk about that. And I've criticized the liberal order many times, that it's not, liberal, it's not early, whatever, all the usual criticisms, but it's the worst order except for all the others. And like, I'm not excited about what's replacing it. I don't think that's going to be better for smaller, so-called weaker states. And I don't think the alternative being offered right now is going to help them. In that sense, being clear about it and realizing it as quickly as you can, I think is a good first step.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm happy about the collapse of liberal order or international order. What I've always wanted is to close the gap between the rhetoric and the reality, or the idealization of, like, Eikenberry presents a very glossy, cherry-picked version of history in order to justify this, like, almost like a myth of hegemony.
Mhm.
And practitioners do whatever the fuck they want with power, but in their minds, they have this glossy model that Eikenberry described. And so my thing is, like, if international order is to be sustainable, ever since I've come to this realization, which was like 10 years ago, I've always expected global rupture. I've always expected a moment like what we're in now. Not as ridiculous as now, but like something like this. Like the hegemon has to collapse in a way that's going to be throwing off terrible things, violence and such. And the reason I expected that is because hypocrisies cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. In order to live with a contradiction, the work of power has to be maintaining the contradiction. And that takes a lot of work, and it forecloses on you doing other things with power that might be useful. So like American hegemony under an Obama or a Biden invested a lot in trying to preserve the contradictions of its own global leadership, its own global domination, but not closing the gap between rhetoric and reality. And I'm like, I accept that international order is a good, positive thing. I accept that global public goods maybe are hard to be provided for except by a dominant power. But that system, insofar as it's good, cannot last if you don't shrink the gap between how you imagine it and how it actually is. And there's never, even when I worked in the Obama administration, I just never felt that there was any attempt to close that gap or to acknowledge the hypocrisy. And so a major step in the right direction is what Carney is saying, but he's saying it like 40 years too late. I mean, like, it's too late now. And that's
better late than never, I guess.
Yeah. But this, like, you had gestured at this idea that, like, well, now that international order is collapsing, it's going to be some gnarly shit. Like, this is not going to be good. And it hasn't been good. The collapse predates this speech. The speech is catching us up, you know? And so my language in a previous thing I wrote was like, we are in an emerging multipolarity. Multipolarity, as we know, is like, well, people debate this, but generally it's like not good. Like there's more room for conflicts and mistrust and blah, blah, blah. So that's what we're trending toward. I don't think multipolarity has to be that kind of like dog eat dog kind of shit though. Like, and this is where I converged a little bit with Carney, where it's like, the world doesn't have to fall into just sort of predatory great powers doing whatever they will until we all die. Like, we can take another path here. And I profoundly agree with that. I don't think that he did much to articulate what that path looks like. And I think that might be one of my bigger frustrations.
Well, no, that's understandable. I mean, I remember a long time ago at APSA observing a panel with Eikenberry and Mearsheimer, and Eikenberry's book had just come out. I think it was Liberal Leviathan. I don't remember which one. And he gave up and he presented, his thing. And Mearsheimer just got up and was like, basically said, you're an apologist for the American Empire. Basically accused him of being an imperial stooge, which is, as you might expect from Mearsheimer. But yeah, that's true. But what's the alternative? The alternative is what Mearsheimer is proposing, which is basically the great powers have a sphere of influence and they have special assurances or they have special interests in the region. I don't think that's better. I'm starting to like hypocrisy, I have to say. I was not a big fan of hypocrisy 10 years ago, but it is the tribute vice pays to virtue. And now there's no payment at all, right? Trump is not a hypocrite, but is that better? Like, is that really better? Do we want the naked power might makes right attitude instead? There's no hypocrisy there, but is that better for people? I don't think so. So I think I'll take the liberal comfort of I'm going to say partial hypocrisy. You may not agree here. Like that hypocrisy is what you need to sustain a global order where some countries are more powerful than others. Some countries will be more powerful than others. The question is, how do they deal with this fact? Do they adopt this hypocritical facade of rules and norms and break it once in a while, or do they dispense with it completely, as we've seen, and then we get the kind of shitstorm that we're seeing now?
Yeah, I mean, if the choice is between a liberal hypocrisy that is the sort of comfort food that we've known most of our lives, or a predatory world of great powers doing what they want, where there's no law but the jungle, almost everybody who's not the predator chooses the hypocrisy, of course. I think that trying to say it's option A or option B is the same as saying there is no alternative to whatever it is that you want. And that's just not true. The world, we wake up and this is my constructivist side emerging, but like we wake up and we make the world that we live in, like we make choices and then those choices, reify or remake reality. Like that's facts. And I think we could make different kinds of choices to avoid both what was and what is emerging now. Within America, we have MAGA, and MAGA is this sort of predatory imperialist kind of imagination. But like, we also have social democrats and progressives who are waging a war within the Democratic Party. And if America gets to have elections still, which is like not guaranteed, but like assuming we do, the policies of that section of American politics are quite popular. And, you just need the right kinds of like political configurations and meet the moment kind of shit. If you had politicians like that taking over the American state, they could meet Carney halfway. Like America could, like, I think if a liberal like Biden were to win again, I think they would still insist they're too conditioned to like liberal hegemony type stuff. They're too in love with American power per se. They've refused even now to see the hypocrisies of how they rule, how they dominate. And so I don't think like American liberals are capable of meeting Carney halfway. I think American, whatever you call them, progressive social democrats are. And I think there's a bank shot, very unlikely scenario where a different kind of political force takes over the American state. This is my hope to avoid like depression, right? But
it's very optimistic on your part, but please.
I recognize that. And so, yeah, like if a different kind of political actor takes over the American state, that actor can bridle American power in a way that is responsible, that is channeling a kind of Hans Morgenthau view of power, and that recognizes we can't simply relive the hypocrisies of the old system, right? And so maybe you can take things from the old system that you want to preserve, but not the hypocrisies part. Like I think that if you want to do liberal ordering again, not live with the hypocrisies, try to remedy the hypocrisies. And I think if we had done that the whole time, we wouldn't be in this moment right now. Like my theory is basically the theory of gap closing for the sake of international order, if that makes sense.
Okay, maybe this is my Soviet cynicism. But like, who the hell is going to do that? What politician in 28? Newsom?
No,
he's not going to do that. Like, I agree. Like, if everybody thought like you, we would be in a much better place.
Let me play like just the last little bit of his speech. It's more in the what is to be done part.
We have a recognition of what's happening and a determination to act accordingly. We understand that this rupture calls for more than adaptation. It calls for honesty about the world as it is. We are taking the sign out of the window. We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. But we believe that from the fracture, we can build something bigger, better, stronger, more just. This is the task of the middle powers. The countries that have the most to lose from a world of fortresses and the most to gain from genuine cooperation. The powerful have their power. But we have something too. The capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, to build our strength at home, and to act together. That is Canada's path. We choose it openly and confidently, and it is a path wide open to any country willing to take it with us.
That I skipped over the part where he like listed the policy stuff that expresses this pivot, if you will. But the thing I think that drives me a little bit crazy about this is this middle power fetish stuff. Middle powers like to talk about themselves as middle powers, but like even in the literature on middle powers, I kind of feel like it doesn't mean anything. Except I used to think that it meant that you were like in Australia, they self-consciously think of themselves or did as a sub-imperial power. That's like that's language that they use sometimes. And I find that grotesque. And the idea that like you're recognizing American hegemony as a kind of imperium, and then you are explicitly putting your power in service of that imperium, I find to be just absolutely fucking insane and like amoral. That's what I understood middle powers to be referring to. But Carney is kind of like fetishizing it in a different way, where it's like, well, we have power to like remake the world in ways that like smaller nations maybe don't. Like, do you have any thoughts about middle power or Canada as a middle power?
Yeah. So yeah, it's basically he's trying to do some version of the non-aligned movement for the 21st century. I think he say if the U.S. is not going to go for it, certainly not Russia or China, we can't leave it up to them. We have to rebuild. We have to build our own thing. So he's still at heart, I think, a fan of the rules-based order. However heavy the quotes you want to put around that phrase, that's what he's interested in. Basically, what I liked about Carney's speech is he's saying, look, we've put up with the useful fiction because it was useful. It's not so useful anymore. Let's be pragmatic about this. Let's recognize things the way they are. That's the whole living in the lie thing. And that's also Gramscian, actually. Like we've been inculcated into this way of thinking no more, right? We are paying a price for that now. And in that sense, that's a healthy development to me. I don't know what that means in terms of practical policy choices. I don't know if it means anything beyond rhetoric, but he got that standing ovation. Apparently, the third time that's ever happened at Davos. It was
Oh wow.
Yeah, Nelson Mandela got one, Zelensky got one, and now Carney. So that's a small club. At least in terms of rhetoric, I think it captured a lot of what people were thinking, and that's, if nothing else, that's a healthy development for how we think about things moving forward.
Yeah, it's more. There's so many concerns I have about this, and I wouldn't let his speech or his vision stand in for like my project or something like that. But this is more than I ever would have expected to see from this guy or from a Canadian prime minister in general. So like a rich country head of state, like this is something.
Well, it has to come from a rich country for it to have any weight, right? Because people in Gaza can complain about the liberal order or whatever, but nobody cares, right? Unfortunately, but that's the truth.
Yeah, presidents in Latin America have said versions of this before and nobody cared.
Oh, for decades,
Yeah.
right? It has to come from the imperial core or somebody right next to the imperial core, right? That's the only way these words have weight. For people in Europe, for example, when they heard that, they're like, "Oh shit, we're in the same boat." That's hence the standing ovation. And unfortunately, those are the words that count from people like Carney, not from people in the so-called developing world. That's how you know that the order really is cracking when people like him start saying that stuff.
Yeah. The one worry I have for Canada specifically is actually I'm worried about this in Europe as well. He outlined among his policy initiatives big tax cuts for multinational, like for corporations, and he also outlined doubling the military budget as part of like the policy. There was some stuff about like infrastructure investment and stuff like that too, but this comes from like my whole shtick is class politics of geopolitics. As you're trying to accumulate power, military and otherwise, and then build the nation, if you're doing that at the expense of like social democracy investment, you're destroying the foundations of your power, even though you're supposing the opposite. And like, I don't know how you double the military budget and provide tax cuts except through austerity. And when you start doing austerity and you're cutting public education and you're cutting healthcare services, you're cutting, support for unemployment, and like that's the shit that like spawns the far right. You know what I mean? Like who seizes on those grievances the best? Fucking fascists, you know? So I am worried about that. And I don't think he intends to go that way. But like when I just zoom out, how do you avoid that if you're jacking up the military spending and still providing tax cuts? Like that seems impossible, you know?
Well, that's exactly the problem Europe is facing, because they hung up the armor that they carried around for centuries, and they chose to spend the money on the welfare state. And now you have people, I forget which European politician it was, that was like, the rest of the world is a jungle, but Europe is a garden. Well, it's a garden because you don't have to spend money on the military. And yes, as soon as they start cutting social programs and spending money on the military, the whole thing changes. And that's what's being forced upon them by Trump. This is why this is so bad for the rest of the world, right? It's not just bad for the US. It's all these countries are now forced to become more like the US, in that they have to cut their welfare spending and focus on the military just to deal with the US. Like all those things you're talking about, those are going to be the immediate and the medium term implications of that. I really don't see any way out of that. And there's nothing Carney can really say to assuage that. Like if the alternative is that we become more independent, or that we cut the supply chains, that we diversify, that we put more military in the Arctic, well, then you're changing into a very different type of country. You're not a garden anymore. And I guess that's what you have to do to deal with the US, but it doesn't mean that things will get better. So I'm pretty pessimistic. Even if Europe gets their shit together and everybody, I'm pretty pessimistic about the future of the global order and global democracy, certainly because of all those things. Yeah.
Me too. And that fucking sucks. We need to come up with some alternative way, man.
Hey, we never got to talk about your martial arts. I wanted to hear more about your progression through that.
Jiu-jitsu? Yeah.
Yeah.
Back in like the global financial crisis days, I started training in mixed martial arts, and part of that I was training Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I did not like getting punched in the face, and I loved the sort of logic puzzle nature of jiu-jitsu, like control the chaos, and you could overcome people that were like much larger than you, and that just it was like cocaine.
See, you're anticipating what I was going to say, which is that if you think middle countries should be smarter about dealing with great powers, jiu-jitsu is the perfect mentality. How do you use their own strength against them?
Yep.
And flip them over if you have to.
Yep.
To bring it all back together. That's kind of what Carney is trying to do. How do we flip this thing on its head and see how that gets us?
Yeah. Find points of leverage, and jiu-jitsu is the way for that to save the world.
Well, Putin is a big fan of jiu-jitsu. So.
Yeah, that's right. That sucks. But there's a lot of scumbags who are part of my world. There's something interesting about martial arts in general, where it's like you're engaging in a kind of combat, but you're doing it consensually and like on terms that are incredibly respectful and reciprocal. It creates a kind of love, like it creates a kind of like affinity, and that is like such a powerful thing separate from the content of the techniques and stuff like that. It's like trust with another human, even another human who like generally has politics that are totally opposite of you, Like I train with cops and drug dealers and gym bros and construction workers and gangsters, and
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, that's I would imagine I've never done these, but I imagine there's a bond there that's hard to replicate.
All right. Well, where can people find your newsletter?
Yeah, hegemonsubstack.com.
Is it hegemon.substack?
I guess I'm not really sure.
Come on.
I'm sorry. I just write it. I don't know where. I think it's Hegemon. If you Google Hegemon Substack or whatever, you should find it.
Seva is a very good political scientist, and his Substack is quite good. It's better than his ability to recall the name. Okay. Well, I hope we meet in person sometime soon. All right, man. Take care.
All right. That was fun.